Okay, we're going to talk just a little bit about just using delay instead of reverbs or reverb effects or impulse responses. And we already talked about the reason why you might want to do that. And if you've come far along enough in your sound sculpting and production to understand that you need some reverberation effects that are basically delay and character, but you need to do them without any character. You spend a lot of time sound sculpting what you're working on, and you don't want anything to add character to it. You just need that delay effect that's adding body, like a reverberation. Real quick, I'm not going to get real in depth in this, but I'm going to kind of open some doors so that you can investigate into it and give you some ideas. Some of the ideas can be very complex and CPU intensive. But some of them can't be. If you really play around with it, that you'll find that, try to keep it straight in your mind from the things we've talked about, that you're just looking for delay effects. You're trying to get delay effects without adding any character. So the first thing we want to look at is, when we're talking about that type of delay in a room response, that, you've got, initial response, primary reflections, early reflections, late reflections, and the problem with them is they're most of the time fairly random. The ununiformity of them is a problem, because when you look at an impulse response, most of the time that you will see that it's very randomized. It's not real straightforward and, has a pattern. And if you actually go to take and look at you look at an impulse response and really go down into it and look at it, and really go down into the milliseconds, and hundreds of milliseconds, that you'll really start to realize that it's a very random pattern. And it's the response of the room that's carrying the frequency response, which is going to carry those delays and the actual frequency response and the tonalities of it with it. But the randomness of it is what is kind of the problem. So when you've got, you want to try to do this with just delays because you don't want any character in there. So how are you going to do that? Well, it's kind of complex, but a real simple. I'm going to try to make this simple without making it too complex, because it can be very complex. I've spent hours and hours and hours messing with this, trying to get some type of a preset set up that I can go to. One thing is it can be kind of CPU intensive. You might have 40 or 50 plugins, in line, to be trying to get this done, but the cool thing is, if you set up some kind of preset like this, that, you can always render the audio. You can always, put it on a track, get it done and render it so it's not, being a CPU glut on your production. Just, make sure it's the way you want it, and then keep a copy of it that hasn't been processed with that in your file, a pre-processed, example of it, in case you have to go back and go, oh, well, it was a little bit too much like that. And so, but go real light, and you'll find that if you had to add a little bit more to it later, that the addition of more won't be as intensive as the initial trying to get it set up to where it sounds okay. But anyway, so you can do this in series or parallel. I've got this set up in parallel. And basically, I've got a clean channel clean line coming over through here, and then a bunch of these set up in progression in parallel. And you could have hundreds of them across there. And the thing is that when you're dealing with that, the first thing I got a real basic delay here for my studio set on here. And the delay is like the first one set like 12.2, the next one set at like 24.4, and then 36.6. Those are all underneath the Haas effect that don't sound like they're doubling yet. And then you can start adding more on them in degrees: 40 milliseconds, 50 milliseconds, 60 milliseconds, 70, 80 milliseconds, and then just keep stacking them like that. And and the problem is, you want the feedback set to where you're getting that feedback so it's tailing out, but not too much to where it starts feeding back and looping really hard. So you got to kind of back off on that some. And normally I'll put the mix to 100%, and then I'll go back through and start bringing some of them down or some of them up. But that's a real simple concept, and you've set up in parallel all these delays that are doing that, at different, at different millisecond intervals. Now, so you're going to get this reverberation effect that's going to be delays coming at you, right? And the higher the multiples get, it'll start sounding more like slapback towards you're getting an actual delay. And on a lot of those ones, you're going to want to back off on the volume a lot so they're not so loud. The reverberation, you want them to blend in instead of standing out too much. The shorter millisecond ones, you'll find that, as you drop the volume down, that they'll blend in fairly well. So I hope I made that concept real easy to understand so that, that just the basic getting those delays in parallel, or you can run them in series also. I do them in parallel so they're each separate so I can go through them. So I can set up a preset that I can go through and adjust later. I can say, well, I've got this preset up to where it's got a pretty long tail on it and it's got a nice full sound, and I'm going to go back for certain applications and adjust it, differently for how long I want to trail out and the intensities of different reflections. Because basically I'm trying to use each one of those delays as, a simulation of a reflection. So that's basically what I do. That way I get no character when I've spent a lot of time building character into a sound, and I need that reverberation, that delay coming at me to build that body from front to back and to fill that, fill in the actual sound with, with one of the things reverb, people use it for. So I'll use it for that. And like I said, a lot of times that this is for spatialization, not as much for reverb. It can be. You can do some really cool things with this. And the other thing, you're dealing with the randomization. So, one of the ways to deal with the randomization, this is like an extreme tremolo. And it's got a step response here, and I'll go through it and I'll set it up on different ones differently. On different one of these delays that I have, I'll put one of these tremolos on it, or something that's causing some randomness of its volume. It's going up or it's down or it's a little bit along there. And I'll have them set up to where they're fairly random all the way across. Each one of these are set up just a little bit differently, so that, that randomness, that not only is it, I'm adjusting the volume so that, that I'm kind of hearing how it's reflecting back. So none of them are really, standing out too much. And then I'll cause some randomness. That way that, not only that, but that way when you're, all of those, this delay right here is going to get a whole lot of randomness. Its volume and its decibel level and how it's the depth of it, and how deep it's coming in. That's going to randomize, and, the more random steps you can get, you can parallel a couple of these. The problem is it won't stand still. So, I mean, you get, 36 steps or more. The more steps you can get, the better it's going to come out as far as that randomness. But I've found even just something like this does a pretty good job for what I want it to do, because I get some really good depth, but I don't get any character. I'm getting no character from my tremolo, from that tremolo causing some kind of randomness, and I'm getting no kind of character from my delay that's interfering with the sound sculpting I've done. I don't want any frequency response from the room or frequency response from that plug-in. I don't want to mess with any of that kind of stuff. And then, that's fairly basic. That way that you've got a pretty good representation of that randomness, or you're attempting to, I can't say that it's that good of a representation of it, but normally for that spatialization that you're trying to do, that it'll do a pretty good job of that. It really will. And you really won't notice by the time you get done that it's not reverb. You'll notice that echoing effect and that reverberation effect without the character that may color the sound. So, and one other thing is when we had talked about, the coloration. Now, if you get on there also and you decide, well, I also want to add just a little bit of color, it just doesn't quite sound right, sound quite right, and you kind of want to mess with it, that, you can put on some type of reverb at the end of that whole chain, at the end of it. And you can add some dampness or some population or reflexivity or whatever you want. And you can actually add some more reverberation to it if it's not going to affect it and it's not going to color it. And the reason why I'm putting this video on here, because sometimes when I do a lot of sound sculpting, so when I get done, sometimes I really don't want to mess with something. But sometimes after I get done, I'll go back and I'll go, oh, well, maybe I could have used a little bit more of this or that or the other thing. and so I'll go back. But a lot of times this is just for when you're really trying to avoid any colorization or any character addition to anything you're trying to add that reverberation and that delays to. And one other thing I wanted to show you, so I mean, I hope I made that real simple. It's a real complex subject, and I could make videos, you know, I could make so many videos on this it wouldn't even be funny. But, you know, I'm not going to, you know, I'm trying to lay that basic concept out there, and those multiples and that some kind of tremolo or something that's going to cause randomization of those to try to emulate that echoing effect, and you know, the randomization of how that effect happens in an impulse response. And the other thing I want to talk about is actually using it to build an impulse response. Okay, since you might not have a gun in your house, and I don't expect you, I don't recommend you get one out to get yourself an impulse response, you know, but something really cool is if you can just get a clap, you know, just a clap, you know, I mean, one that doesn't have a whole lot of reverberation, or that's fairly clean, or get one yourself, you know, make yourself a little amniotic chamber around you and just get a clap, you know, that initial clap. Now, you can EQ this, you can tune this, you can do all the things we talked in the previous video to try to set it up for what you're trying to, you know, what kind of frequency response you want to have it. You can time stretch it, you can do all the stuff we talked about doing in the other video to this. But the cool thing is you can take that whole setup that I showed you, and you can put it on this track. You can put that clap on there, and then you can render that to audio. All right. So now what you have is, after you've rendered that to audio, let's see, I don't know if I have it set up on here right now, but maybe I do. And the cool thing is, if you take this and render this to audio, and you say, okay, I'm done, and I've got those reverbs set up the way I want them, and I want to transform this to rendered audio. So what's going to happen? If you transfer that to rendered audio, what did you just end up with? You just got an impulse response, right? So all you have is that clap, just like the gun for the impulse response, and you've tried to make like an amniotic chamber for it to where it's not, you know, getting any kind of, you know, interference or character from the room, and you've added delays to it, right? So now you've added a bunch of delays with the randomness and all the stuff we talked about, and now you have your own impulse response that you created just like that, all right? Now you can get in there and do the same stuff from the last video to this impulse response and carve that and sculpt that the way you want it. So, I mean, I know that's a complex subject and it sounds kind of strange, but I mean, you can do all kinds of things like that. And a lot of the things that you can do in the part that I was talking about creating those delays and the tremolo, there's all kinds of different ways to do that, but that's a basic setup to get you started. And if you get some other shit rolling around in your head, you're like, well, I could do that, and you know, that would be really cool, and then I could put that on a clap or something else, or I banged a mallet on the table or something, you know, or whatever, you know, to get that initial, you know, response to work with, and then, you know, build your own impulse response that way with those delays. And all kinds of other, and you can actually add some reverberation to it, and all kinds of other things to actually sculpt your own impulse response the way you want it. And then you can go back, and then you can go through the stuff that we talked about in the last video about sculpting your impulse response to come out with something that's totally unique that you worked out yourself for all kinds of different applications, or it's built the way you want it, and, you know, and it's something that's very clean to have no character for you to apply when you need that, if you need that kind of, you know, if you need that type of reverberation so that you don't affect the character of the sound you spent so much time working on. So I hope I made that very simple. That can be very complex and very difficult to do, but the basic concept of it isn't that hard to understand. And, you know, it takes some time for you working that out. But if you spend some time doing it, you're creating your own impulse responses, and you're creating your own type of delay effects, the reverberations that have no character built into them to affect whatever you're trying to put those types of effects onto. So I hope that was fairly basic and a fairly good description of what I was trying to explain and the applications of that, and what, you know, how those can be really good applications to help you in your production for a really clean production, when you're really worried about issues about your reverberations and things like that, coloring the sound of something you've spent a lot of time sculpting yourself. So I hope you learned something from that. And thanks for watching the video, and peace, hope, love.